Snow White, 2025. The 2025 live-action Snow White remake reimagined the classic fairy tale with a modern aesthetic, colorblind casting, reworked character motivations, and CGI dwarfs replacing live actors. These stylistic shifts sparked controversy around racial representation, faithfulness to the original material, and tone. Despite Rachel Zegler's praised performance, critics criticized disjointed storytelling, uneven visual execution, and an unclear creative vision. Many reviews noted clashing costume design and inconsistent tone, particularly citing choices like modern clothing elements undermining the fantasy setting. The film had a production and marketing budget estimated between $240 million and $410 million. It grossed approximately $205 million worldwide, which analysts categorize as a significant financial failure and one of Disney's most underperforming live-action remakes in years. In some regions, critics labeled it a cultural misstep, and overall, reviews ranged from mixed to negative. Children, however, offered a contrasting view. While less impressed by new songs and some performances, they appreciated Snow White's independence and feminist undertones. Descendants: The Rise of Red, 2024. This Disney Plus original film continued the Descendants franchise, shifting focus to Red, the daughter of the Queen of Hearts from Alice in Wonderland. The story followed Red teaming up with Chloe, the daughter of Cinderella, as they traveled back in time to prevent a coup that would change the future of Auradon. The narrative emphasized themes of female friendship, rebellion against oppressive systems, and finding one's own voice in a world dominated by legacy and expectation. While the film achieved a milestone as the most streamed Disney Plus live-action original movie on its premiere weekend, the reception was polarizing. Supporters praised the musical numbers and the franchise's commitment to showcasing strong female leads. However, many longtime fans and critics felt the movie leaned too heavily into overt empowerment messaging. Instead of balancing charm, humor, and camp like earlier Descendants entries, The Rise of Red often pushed its themes directly, leading some viewers to call it preachy and formulaic. The creative decision to frame Red's arc around rejecting her mother's tyrannical legacy highlighted Disney's broader pattern of positioning daughters of villains as misunderstood rebels rather than fully villainous figures. This approach reinforced critiques that the franchise prioritized girl boss empowerment branding over more nuanced storytelling, leaving The Rise of Red grouped with Disney projects seen as prioritizing social statements above narrative originality. Hocus Pocus 2, 2022. The sequel to the 1993 cult classic brought back the Sanderson sisters, reintroducing them as mischievous witches in the modern day. The original Hocus Pocus had balanced quirky comedy, mild horror, and the villains' over-the-top personalities. In the new film, however, the tone shifted toward framing the sisters as campy feminist icons rather than primarily antagonists. The plot placed greater emphasis on their bond as sisters and positioned them against patriarchal figures and traditions, while also introducing a new generation of empowered teenage girls who paralleled them. This approach received criticism from longtime fans. Many felt the sequel abandoned the darker comedic charm of the original in favor of overt empowerment themes and self-aware messaging. Instead of being portrayed as threatening villains, the Sandersons were softened into sympathetic figures whose main conflict was reframed as resisting oppression. For some viewers, this undercut what had made the first movie memorable and transformed the sequel into a less engaging, message-driven narrative. As a result, Hocus Pocus 2 was often described as part of Disney's broader trend of injecting empowerment motifs into stories at the expense of tone and originality. Strange World, 2022. Strange World was marketed as a groundbreaking Disney release, featuring a diverse cast of characters and centering its story on themes of environmental stewardship and family legacy. The plot followed the Clade family as they explored a mysterious underground ecosystem, with the central conflict revolving around protecting natural resources and confronting ecological destruction. The film also highlighted generational conflict, with each member of the family representing a different perspective on responsibility, progress, and tradition.
Grandpa's awesome!
He is not awesome! You gave me a machete for my birthday?
Classic Jaeger Clade.
I was 2.
Despite these ambitions, the movie was a major commercial failure and quickly became associated with Disney's girl boss and progressive branding trend. Critics noted that while the film was visually creative, its storytelling felt bland and formulaic, with themes presented more as statements than as character-driven arcs. The focus on diversity and empowerment, while notable, was often seen as forced, layered on top of weak pacing and underdeveloped emotional stakes. The lack of memorable characters or engaging conflict reinforced the perception that Strange World prioritized political and social messaging over the fundamentals of strong storytelling. This imbalance led to its box office collapse and solidified its reputation as one of Disney's most visible modern flops. Miss Marvel, 2022. Miss Marvel introduced Kamala Khan, a Pakistani-American teenager from Jersey City who becomes a superhero after discovering her powers. The show emphasized themes of cultural identity, generational conflict within immigrant families, and the empowerment of a young woman who idolizes superheroes before becoming one herself. Kamala's journey highlighted diversity and representation, presenting her as a modern role model for audiences often underrepresented in mainstream superhero media. Reception was divided. Supporters praised the cultural detail and fresh perspective, but critics argued that the writing leaned more on empowerment messaging than on building a tightly constructed story. The narrative was seen as inconsistent, shifting between coming-of-age comedy, family drama, and superhero action without fully developing any one element. Detractors also noted that Kamala was portrayed as almost instantly capable, with little struggle compared to other Marvel heroes.
And then it actually happened. But it's not as great as you imagined it.
This contributed to perceptions that the show prioritized representation and empowerment branding above grounded character development. As a result, Miss Marvel was often labeled as another Disney project following the girl boss formula rather than standing out as a compelling story in its own right. Moana 2. 2024. The sequel to Moana returned to the story of the Polynesian heroine 8 years after her original journey. In this continuation, Moana once again sets sail across the ocean, this time guided by ancestral voices calling her to unite distant islands. The film emphasized her role as a leader rather than a daughter seeking independence, framing her as the central figure responsible for reconnecting her people with their traditions and the wider world. The story expanded on themes of destiny, resilience, and empowerment, presenting Moana as a figure who needed no romantic subplot or external partner to achieve her goals. Despite anticipation, the sequel received mixed reactions. Some audiences praised the animation quality and cultural details, but noted that the narrative felt familiar and repetitive, echoing many beats of the first film. Critics argued that Moana was once again portrayed with minimal flaws or personal setbacks, which made her appear more like a symbolic empowerment figure than a fully realized character. The absence of meaningful internal struggle led to claims that the movie leaned into Disney's formula of girl boss storytelling, focusing on independence and leadership without grounding those qualities in deeper character development. As a result, while commercially successful, Moana 2 was often discussed alongside other Disney projects that were criticized for prioritizing empowerment branding over originality and emotional depth. Brave, 2012. Brave was Pixar's first feature centered entirely on a princess character, Merida. The film was marketed as a bold subversion of Disney's traditional princess formula, presenting Merida as a rebellious and independent heroine who refused to accept an arranged marriage. The central conflict focused on her defiance of her mother, Queen Eleanor, and the cultural expectations surrounding her role as a royal daughter. Instead of pursuing romance, Merida's story revolved around freedom, archery skills, and rejecting male suitors. At release, the film was praised for its animation and attempt at empowerment, but over time, criticism grew. Many argued the story lacked the emotional depth and layered character arcs expected from Pixar films such as Up or Inside Out. The empowerment message, centered on independence and rejecting tradition, was seen as outweighing genuine character growth. Instead of Merida evolving in meaningful ways, much of the plot relied on surface-level defiance and magical elements like her mother's transformation into a bear. This imbalance between theme and storytelling led some audiences to retroactively label Brave as a weak entry, associated more with girl boss branding than with the nuanced storytelling Pixar was known for. Maleficent, Mistress of Evil, 2019. This sequel shifted the focus fully onto Maleficent and Aurora, presenting their relationship as the central dynamic while pushing traditional male characters into the background. The story introduced a large-scale conflict where women led armies and kingdoms, positioning Maleficent and Queen Ingrid as opposing forces of power. This framing was intended to highlight female leadership and strength, building on the first film's attempt to redefine the Sleeping Beauty story from Maleficent's perspective. However, audiences criticized the sequel for leaning too heavily on empowerment-driven spectacle rather than story depth. While the first Maleficent balanced darker themes with emotional nuance, Mistress of Evil was seen as flattening those qualities into a simplified, girl power narrative. The battles between female leaders felt less like organic storytelling and more like symbolic statements. As a result, the movie received mixed reviews, with many concluding that the feminist reframing overshadowed the character complexity that had made the first film more compelling. Cruella, 2021. Cruella reimagined the origin story of Cruella de Vil, one of Disney's most infamous villains. Instead of focusing on her original obsession with Dalmatian fur, the film reframed her as an ambitious, punk-inspired fashion designer fighting her way through a patriarchal industry. The conflict centered on her rivalry with the Baroness, a powerful female fashion mogul who embodied the system Cruella sought to overcome. The movie's style emphasized rebellion, independence, and empowerment, portraying Cruella as a misunderstood genius rather than a straightforward villain. Critics and audiences were divided on this reinterpretation. Some praised the visuals and Emma Stone's performance, but many questioned whether turning a dog-skinning villain into a feminist anti-hero was necessary or believable. The empowerment tropes, positioning Cruella as an underdog rising against oppression, were seen by some as forced onto a character whose original appeal was her unapologetic villainy. By reshaping her into a symbol of rebellion, Disney blurred her identity, leaving viewers uncertain if the film was a critique of power structures or simply a branding exercise. This tension led to the perception that the movie fit the girl boss trend without offering the depth or moral clarity to support it. Frozen, 2013. Frozen became one of Disney's most successful modern films, largely due to Elsa's storyline and the breakout anthem Let It Go. The film positioned Elsa as a heroine who rejects fear and embraces her powers rather than being restrained by tradition or societal expectations. Unlike earlier Disney princesses, Elsa's arc avoided romance entirely, focusing instead on independence, identity, and self-acceptance.
Completely frozen.
Please, just stay away!
Elsa! I'll bring her back and I'll make this right.
So you're not scared?
She's my sister. She would never hurt me.
Anna's subplot reinforced this by challenging the idea of love at first sight marriages, critiquing older Disney tropes in favor of a more cautious and practical message. While audiences embraced the film at release, backlash grew over time. Critics argued that Frozen marked the beginning of Disney's formulaic approach to empowerment narratives. Let It Go in particular was seen as symbolic of a broader girl boss trend, where the theme of rejecting limits overshadowed deeper character development. For some fans, Elsa's empowerment appeared inserted as a message first and a story second, setting a pattern for later films that emphasized independence and defiance over complexity. This perception has caused Frozen, despite its popularity, to be grouped with later Disney works criticized for prioritizing empowerment branding over balanced storytelling. Moana, 2016. Moana was designed as a heroine-driven adventure, focusing on a young Polynesian girl who sets out alone to restore balance to the ocean by returning the heart of Te Fiti. Unlike classic Disney princesses, Moana had no romantic subplot.
I'm not going on a mission with some little girl.
This is my canoe, and you will journey to different.
Her journey emphasized independence, leadership, and fulfilling her destiny as the future chief of her people. The film's narrative centered on courage, resourcefulness, and the empowerment of a young woman defying obstacles without reliance on traditional romance or external rescue. Although the movie was widely praised for animation and cultural representation, it also became part of the girl boss discussion. Some critics argued that the story followed a familiar formula, a young woman challenging tradition, guided by a powerful inner calling, and ultimately succeeding on her own terms. The lack of personal flaws or meaningful setbacks in Moana's character arc led some to feel the empowerment narrative came at the expense of depth. Over time, the film has been cited as an example of Disney leaning on empowerment as a brand identity rather than grounding it in complex storytelling. Enchanted, 2007, and Disenchanted, 2022. Enchanted introduced Giselle, a fairy tale princess transported into modern-day New York. The film playfully subverted Disney's classic tropes, poking fun at naive romance and the happily ever after formula while still celebrating the charm of fairy tales. Audiences generally received the film warmly because it balanced satire with sincerity. Its sequel, Disenchanted, leaned much harder into empowerment themes. Giselle, now living in the suburbs, faces dissatisfaction with domestic life and transforms into a stepmother figure who begins to turn villainous. The film attempted to comment on stereotypes of women in fairy tales, presenting Giselle's struggle as a metaphor for independence, self-definition, and resisting restrictive roles. However, many viewers felt the messaging was heavy-handed. Instead of the charm and clever humor of the first film, the sequel emphasized empowerment statements at the expense of narrative balance. This shift resulted in criticism that Disenchanted prioritized social commentary over story quality, leaving it far less celebrated than its predecessor. Black Widow, 2021. Black Widow was positioned as Natasha Romanoff's long-overdue solo film after more than a decade of appearances in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The story explored her past as a spy and assassin, her estranged family ties, and her attempt at closure before the events of Avengers Endgame. Central to the film was the exposure of the Red Room, a secret program that manipulated and controlled young women into becoming assassins. By dismantling it, Natasha symbolically freed the next generation from exploitation and reclaimed her agency. The movie received mixed reactions. Many viewers felt it arrived too late in the MCU timeline, released after Natasha's death in Endgame, which reduced the emotional stakes. Others argued the film leaned too heavily on feminist themes, framing Natasha's fight primarily as a liberation of oppressed women, while neglecting the espionage and psychological thriller elements that might have deepened her character. This left some audiences viewing it as more of a thematic statement than a fully realized spy story. As a result, Black Widow was often grouped into critiques of Marvel and Disney, forcing empowerment narratives rather than allowing character-driven storytelling to lead. If you've made it this far, you've seen how Disney's biggest girl boss experiments often backfired with audiences. From remakes to sequels, the pattern shows that empowerment without strong storytelling rarely lands.